hace sentir hondos dolores y me condena a vivir entre miseria.
Today we visit the Justo Vega Municipal Cultural House to meet Susan Metz. Susan is the director of Playback Theater, a project that involves the audience with the actors in order to recreate personal experiences. She decided to come to Cuba 20 years ago to learn Spanish, and after that she decided to develop this type of theater in the island. With Susan Metz, we talk today in From Havana. Thank you very much to accept to talk with us here in Telesur, here in From Havana. It's a pleasure for us.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Well, tell me, what's your story? I mean, how did you start your professional life? Not into playback, but before. I heard you were a teacher before being a playback monitor and playback artist.
I was a high school teacher in Brooklyn, New York, in a mixed community, interestingly, with African American immigrants from the Caribe who were poor and disoriented when they came to big, huge New York City. And it was in a community high school, and I was there for about 26 years, teaching 16-year-olds.
How is the experience of teaching 16 years old, and how do you mix it with, like, not produce, but direct a playback group?
Well, aside from teaching the English language, this is a noun, this is a verb. This is a good book. This book is not so good, you know, because they had to choose their own books. If they were going to read, they had to choose books. So that was part of the difference I had with my school. The challenge was, how do you teach values when my values were not exactly the same as the institution? Because I didn't want them all to read the same book. I didn't feel there was one book that was essential. I felt reading was the real challenge of learning to select what was interesting and understand how to accept information. It was a lot of adjusting to being an agent of a society when the schools are meant to reproduce things that weren't in favor of the learner, that were in favor of the power structure. So teaching values was always on my mind. And I did integrate, when I started doing playback theater, for my own growth. When I found it, because I was looking for learning theory. Even in teacher preparation, which I started in university to prepare to be a high school teacher, we didn't really study how teenagers learn. So I had to look for it, and I became a kind of amateur psychologist, an amateur social worker, as well as having to study English and being an English teacher, because I felt those things were necessary to be successful as a teacher. And in my search, I came to the Association for Humanistic Psychology. There I started studying psychodrama, and in a psychodrama conference, I came across the original playback theater company, because Jonathan Fox and I were in a session on educating for values, and during the session we looked at each other and we smiled, and I said, gee, that's an interesting man. And he said, we have playback theater here, and we're starting to offer it. Come to our session. And that was it. So I said, okay, I'm interested in psychodrama, but I'm not going to be a psychologist. I'm not going to be a therapist. I'm a teacher. Playback theater. And that's how I came to.
On that line, how much playback has of therapy, of group therapy and personal therapy?
Well, I like to call it growth rather than therapy, because we're not qualified and our aim is not to repair. Therapy implies healing. Well, there is a certain kind of healing, but I think it's social healing, not psychological healing, because many of our societies are fractured, are broken, and we need to repair our communities, and that's what playback offers, because we're a community performance form that's improvisational and participatory in ways that other cultural forms are not. So we can offer that, and that is part of why we're here and now preparing to participate in January in an international conference for balance in the world.
You came to Cuba for the first time more like 20 years ago, right? With
Correct.
Pastor for Peace. How did Cuba got into your life?
I started working in playback theater when I was a high school teacher to conserve my sense of humor.
Okay, that's it.
And keep my spontaneity. So I was responding authentically to my students, and I could stay playful with them, and it worked. So I was really committed, and I went to sessions and I trained, and of course I was teaching, so I was adapting some of that, the methodology of participation and spontaneity to my teaching work. And well, 30 years later, I graduated, I retired, and I knew that I had an affinity with Latin America and that I wanted to study Spanish. So I had studied in Mexico. I had participated during the 80s in the Central America solidarity work, trying to end the Contra War, illegal war against the Sandinistas that the American government, the Reagan administration, was perpetrating. I went to Nicaragua several times. We had delegations, and when I retired and I wanted to learn Spanish, I had also been in Mexico, studied Spanish. Everybody said, wait, oh no, one friend, Jean Weissman, who I will be forever indebted to. She said, Susan, before you decide where you're going to study Spanish, go to Cuba. Oh, Jean, everybody goes to Cuba. The whole left goes to Cuba. They don't really need me. Well, that's true, but go anyway and see how it feels. Well, it was so different and so interesting and so involving and so spontaneous that I said, well, okay, it's right. I'll go study Spanish in Cuba. So when I started studying Spanish, I knew that any real cultural exchange means you receive and you offer. So I offered to teach English, which was my profession. So for 2 winters, I taught 1 year at Verona, the Pedagogical Institute in Havana. And the following year, I taught English at the Franc País Institute Pedagógico in Santiago. And that was how I started to love Cuba.
And you've seen a growing in playback here in Cuba?
Because I started with a project in the community of the prevention of HIV/AIDS. I made friends with Belkis Vega, who's a filmmaker, and was a friend of my friend Jean's. So one evening, we were both very sad because and I lost so many people, neighbors and friends and colleagues during the beginning of the AIDS epidemic. It's still very painful just to think about it. And Belkis too, so he said, we should do something, a filmmaker and an educator. Okay. So we made an audiovisual project out of it. And we have Viviendo al Límite, living at the edge, or living with limits. I don't know exactly how to translate it. And we have my hour-long 3 stories in playback, living with HIV in Cuba. And that's how playback came. Then Belkis and Oriol Gonzalez went to playback school. I invited them. We got funding, we got contributions, and they went to playback school for a month. And then Abel Prieto invited me to teach playback. I got a letter from the Minister of Culture in Cuba in my mailbox in Brooklyn. Well, when you get a letter from the Minister of Culture, you say, thank you very much, when do you want me, and where? So that, for 2 years, I was teaching all over the island. Well, playback doesn't fit easily anywhere, really, because we're citizen actors. We're not professional artists. I'm a teacher. Joe was a musician. Jonathan, who's the founder, well, he really dedicated his life to developing this. From when he was young, he was studying this kind of playback, and he has several books now, and we translated Joe's book. What is it called? Enacting the real life, enacting real life. Because in playback, we invite somebody, one of you, who has an experience that's interesting and important, that you've been thinking about, that you'd like to share. And an interview, we call it a conductor, and this is the mark that we call the ritual. No, mark is a Spanish word, frame.
Frame, yeah.
It's the frame we call the ritual. And playback has 3 aspects. One is the artistic, where we're artists, we're theater artists. Another is social interaction, because we're interacting with the public. We don't have a script. We don't rehearse. We don't discuss what we're going to do before. We listen to the story that the conductor elicits from the teller, the narrator, and the person who's telling the stories chooses the artists, and those artists, with just like this, and the musician, don't forget there's a musician who works with music, sound, because that's part of our lives. We just improvise. We do the story for you and for the group. And that's socially healing, because we're not looking at beautiful, young, rich people on a screen. We're hearing a story of a neighbor that everybody has gone through, a loss of somebody to an illness that isn't their fault, like the HIV project that we worked on. Or you and I were talking about animals and pets before. It could, the children love animal stories. You know, they all, that's part of their important part is their pet. And I continue, you have a couple of cats, so do I. Who doesn't have some kind of, we love animals. Humans are like, we are animals. We love other animals.
Mamá. Tía Ima, que tú haces aquí sola. Mamá. Mamá. Qué bueno verte, mamita. Qué bueno verte. ¿Pero con quién tú viniste? ¿Quién te trajo? Mamá. Espérate, déjame contarte. Siéntate. ¿Tú no me vas a regañar?
No.
¿No? Me le cambió a mi abuela, mamá. Mira, fue de lo más divertido, porque si le pido dinero, a ella no le va a gustar.
Now, let's go a little further. In January, the International Conference for World Balance, you're going to be part of it. What are you going to do there? What's your project?
We have 22 people coming from 9 countries who are the most experienced playbackeros for the 43 years that we've been studying and practicing and experimenting, and Jonathan and Joe have been teaching it. And I started teaching internationally. Once I was fluent enough in Spanish, I taught in Venezuela, Argentina, I taught in Uruguay. Because at that time, in the early part of this century, there weren't trainers. Now there are. And there's going to be advanced courses now presented in Mexico, and we hope soon we'll be able to invite people and present advanced courses in playback, because we have a community of playback here in Cuba now, after my 20 years of teaching playback. So, we have these folks coming, we have a community of playback in Cuba, and we want to share playback in the communities, because it won't be contained in the Palacio de Convenciones in big groups under lights where everybody's sitting there and there's cabezas hablando, talking heads. No. Playback is participatory, it's spontaneous, and it needs to be with folks, with the community, with the popular movements. So, we're going to come back here, where we are now, which is the Casa de Cultura in Arroyo Naranjo, and a popular neighborhood in the southern part of Havana, which is not glamorous. It's all of us living together. Some are doctors, some are teachers, some are artists, and all of us living together in this popular neighborhood have the great privilege in Cuba of having the movement of community culture, which I studied because I wanted to find where playback theater really fits. And we don't have casas de cultura in the United States. We don't have popular culture where people can come and make these lovely dolls, or the tapices of fabric that are just so charming. You just want to surround yourself with these lovely indigenous works of creativity that come from a popular neighborhood. And that's one of the gifts of the Cuban Revolution that I want to participate in and defend, because it doesn't make money, and that can be an obstacle when you're moving toward a mixed economy. So to defend the Casa de Cultura, to offer a kind of culture that's ours, that isn't rich, young, thin, beautiful, confused young people on the screen who become the center of conversation. No, it's our stories that need to be in our conversation, and our creativity that needs to be shared and developed, and we grow through the practice of playback theater. So, we're going to offer it in the conference to the international progressive movements that come to join. We're expecting 1,500 to 2,000 participants. It's affiliated with UNESCO. It's being organized by Programa Martiano in recognition that our thinking derives in good part from the thinking of Jose Marti, who was a cultural leader, not only a political leader. He wrote poetry, he participated in theater, and that's part of the model that we feel we follow internationally in playback theater.
Now, you talk about progressive movement and that in this conference, and I know that you've been an activist, and how is politics into your life? How is your relationship with politics, and how you use playback for that matter?
Politics is power in use, and it affects everything, every part of our lives. And I entered politics when I was in high school in the movement against the war in Vietnam and in the struggle for the rights of black folks in the South, because there was incredible racism in the North as well. And of course we were stuck in this crazy war going around killing people for no good reason. Okay, so, and my parents were activists. I was born in a leftist community and educated there. And my first teacher was Dr. King. And it was militant nonviolence and breaking the law when the law is unjust. And that informed my decision finally to commit to solidarity work with Cuba, because the blockade is unjust. And I won't let that, I decided that it's a political act on my part, and I'm involved in the solidarity movement, and I always will be. And that's why my gift of playback is to Cuba. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this. It's not perfect because you don't say perfect. How do you call it?
Well, we strive for excellence, but perfection can become a burden. No, not perfect, so but pretty good.
So this
pretty
was
good playback.
Pretty good interview. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure.
It was a pleasure. Thank you all.